My name is Oates, and I have the pleasure interviewing Ula Rutkowska. She is a third-year PhD student in Brown's English Literature program, and she received her master's at the University of Cambridge in Modern and Contemporary English Literature, and she received her bachelor's in English and Politics at Brandeis University. Welcome, Ula.
Thank you, Nakazi.
So I'm so glad to be in conversation with you. So I want to begin with your academic training arc, and I want to begin at the beginning, so at Brandeis. You major in English at Brandeis and politics, but as you pursued your graduate degrees, you have focused on English. So could you tell me what was the most transformative English class that you had at Brandeis?
It's actually kind of hard to answer that necessarily, but maybe what I'll say is that I sort of entered into Brandeis and declared a politics major basically within the first semester. So I finished the entire major within about a year and a half, because I was like, okay, I'm just going to do this. And then I was sort of like, okay, but I have other requirements, so I'll just take this English class. So I took like Intro to Lit, just very basically. And I'd always been a humanities person, but I sort of had, was going through this phase where I wanted to professionalize and be a lot more composed. So I wanted to go to law school and et cetera. But so then I took a class that was just called Modernism. And it was literally just the only thing we did for the whole semester was we read Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus for 3 months. And it was an example of like sustained textual engagement that really engaged with the questions that I was particularly fascinated in at that time. So for example, what causes, what drives mass movements? What is the relationship between art and ideology? And at the same time, I was working for a terrorism research unit called the Western Jihadism Project that was very much, a politics-centered enterprise. And sort of seeing various confluences between one and the other kind of reaffirmed my commitment to the way in which questions are posed in a discipline like English rather than the way in which questions are posed in a discipline like political science. So I sort of more fully embraced my politics major, or my English major with time, in part because I saw resonances between them, but I always felt like the novel was like the way in which I wanted to enter into the world rather than a series of quantitative questions that often felt a bit reductive or incomplete and didn't allow me to have conversations the way that I was having conversations with students in humanities classes.
So that distinction between disciplines, right? So English and politics, I want to take up in this other question about the distinctions between countries, right? So you received your master's at University of Cambridge in English. How was that experience different from learning English in the United States?
Yeah, well, I mean, Cambridge is like obsessed with tradition and with a certain way of doing the humanities. And so there's not very much, I think, there isn't really much space for someone who sees this political possibility to literature. So it's very much still centered on, sort of working within the English literary canon, on Shakespeare, on medieval literature. And so the sort of questions that I was posing didn't really fit into what Cambridge is sort of, is trained to kind of help students figure out. So something like a Collaborative Humanities initiative does not exist there. It's kind of impossible to imagine actually really engaging with students outside of your own sort of field, other than in your sort of like isolated Cambridge college. But like you go to your department and then you don't really have intellectual conversations with people in other departments. Like people really choose English, stick to English, that's about it. So it's kind of, I mean, I kind of knew I wanted to return to the US to do my PhD precisely because it felt more open-minded intellectually. And in that sense, a lot more exciting and just a bit more concerned with allowing students to kind of push boundaries a little bit. Yeah.
So to that point of political possibility within English, your research interest includes war and afterlife, violence and nonviolence, questions related to cosmopolitanism and citizenship. So how do you find your intervention within those particular concepts? So how are you thinking through your sets of questions that you have in relationship to those research topics?
Well, I think one way in which I approach this is that the novel and works of fiction can allow us to enter into these conversations from a slightly different perspective. So I mean, so perhaps, and this is maybe what I've been thinking about lately, is that the novel is itself kind of a form of hospitality or a kind of way into something that you might not be able to enter into otherwise. So it kind of gives you a space within, a space of its own within which to dwell. And to, in the process, kind of engage you in a conversation. And maybe that, yeah, I think this like conversational aspect is quite helpful for me. So for example, like with something like cosmopolitanism, which is sort of about fostering world citizenship, the novel kind of really helps to think about the way in which cosmopolitanism or being cosmopolitan is imagined. Or at the same time, you know, something like violence can be, and here I'm borrowing a tiny bit from Rob Nixon and his book Slow Violence. Violence can be perceived and represented in a work of literature in a way that it might not be possible to do with another medium. So the way in which it can focus on something that is unspectacular but needs to be drawn attention to is something that I think a work of fiction can do that maybe even cinema can't, because it can't engage in that prolonged, sustained way. And I think that prolonged, sustained practice is what's always been so important to me.
I love what you just said about how the novel is a form of hospitality. I'd never heard of it like that before, and think about particular like material cultures as a form of hospitality. And I think about, you know, what happens when a book is given to someone. We then form like book clubs or reading clubs and different things like that. So that is so wonderful to think about.
And it works in both ways. It's both a way of fostering community between people and you know, sort of like an intellectual within your brain community, right? And I mean, Hannah Arendt kind of talks about this, the importance of having a conversation, and Socrates as well, about the importance of having a conversation in your mind between yourself and another. And that's kind of what I see the novel as doing, always allowing us to think in relation to someone else and something else.
And the novel as a particular thinking partner, right? Wow, that's amazing. Because I never thought about it that before, like until you actually like put it in terms like that. So thank you. So you are an instructor this year, which is pretty exciting. And the title of your course is called The Last
18 Years.
Yes. So tell us about that. Tell us about this course and the books and the novels and that you and your students are reading.
Yeah, I mean, I really had this commitment, and I've had this commitment for a while, of reading contemporary novels, like really recently emerging contemporary novels, and how I've, you know, as someone who's also really obsessed with like day-to-day politics, like issues like Brexit or like, you know, Trump's election, I always like somehow found novels helpful to figure these things out. For figuring these things out for myself. So that's kind of what I wanted to do for my students, to maybe say, look at these novels that have been written in the last 18 years, and how they've kind of how they allow us to enter into these conversations and the sort of strange continuities that actually begin to emerge when you start to read contemporary novels. So we read, we started off with Mohsin Hamid's Reluctant Fundamentalist. Now we're ending with a book called The Power by Naomi Alderman, which imagines a world in which women get a superpower and suddenly, like, you know, suddenly women are sort of the stronger sex. I mean, you know, because it all goes awry, the novel's sort of about interrogating power in and of itself rather than trying to acquire power. But so we've also read some Zadie Smith, an Iraq War fiction written by an Iraq War soldier. So it's been a really, like, you know, wide, and Paul Beatty's The Sellout, which was quite a challenging novel because satire is very difficult to teach when you're trying to be very earnest. So yeah, it's sort of over the course of the semester, the novels have been getting progressively more difficult, and I've sort of seen my students like slowly getting really tired of the sort of questions that we're posing. But I think that, yeah, you know, tomorrow's the last day, so we'll see.
Okay.
We'll see how they feel about this strange novel.
And so you began in 2001?
Yes, with 9/11.
With 9/11. Yeah. And presumably your students that you have in your class, they were either very young or they just missed the particular like experience of 9/11. So how was navigating that that particular like week in class?
It's actually curious because I sort of assumed that they would have no kind of like, I don't know, I kind of, I think there was a sort of strange fascination with 9/11 that emerged for them, in which, so sort of for me, like I have a distinct memory of 9/11, but they don't quite have that. So, you know, they don't, their relationship to the event is quite different. Right. So reading a novel that I think is about challenging the way in which, I mean, Mohsin Hamid's novel is very much about situating you in relation to the topics that came up in American public discourse in the aftermath of 9/11 and forcing a response. So how you respond to the novel is meant to tell you something about yourself. So it's kind of curious to watch students very differently respond to the ending of a novel that's meant to challenge you and perhaps trigger a moment of self-critique. So I liked opening the class with that novel precisely because it allows you to engage with how a novel forces you into this uncomfortable space, perhaps, and it's this sort of conversation. And it was really, and I mean, it's quite an easy novel as well, in that it's a quick read. So I think one of my motivations in teaching it was to get the ball rolling quickly, to like really have them latch on to something that was really written to be discussed in a class. And over the course of the semester, the novels have been less digestible. So by the time we reached Swing Time by Zadie Smith, we were pretty tired already. So yeah. It's curious. I don't know. I sometimes feel, I'm only about 4 years older than most of them because the vast majority of them are seniors, which is actually pretty surprising. But still, you know, I was 7 when 9/11 happened, so they were 3. So that's still, you know, like you have memories from when you were 7, but who has memories from when they were 3?
Right. Yeah. So my final question, Ula, is fill in this this sentence. I write because I
like to read.
Awesome. Ula, thank you so much.